This being the last session of the year, as the last home game, I want particularly to thank all the staff of the SNITE who make these events possible. If it weren't for their helpfulness throughout the season, these would not be as much fun as they are. And to Anne Noel in particular, who just left as I began to thank the SNITE staff, and all her team, we owe a great debt. As well as to our wonderful videographer. All of these appear up online very shortly after they're over in the next couple of weeks. So if you want to watch one you missed or watch one again, that's where to find them. Do please tell everyone. Today's talk is by Roy Scranton, who I have to say with great dedication has flown in from New York City just to come and give this talk and is flying back again this evening. He's on leave at the moment, working on the book Total Mobilization, World War II and American Literature, about which he's going to talk today. But since he is also a novelist, I always love the way that novelists describe work in progress. So there are two novels in progress, according to the CV I grabbed. One is I Heart Oklahoma, an experimental novel about three artists making an American road movie. And also Atlantis, and this is the one I really want to read even more than I Heart Oklahoma, a detective novel about the Central Avenue jazz scene and the German emigre community in World War II Los Angeles. Look forward to those. He is the author of Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, Reflections on the End of a Civilization, published in 2015, and his novel War Porn, which came out from Soho Press last year, 2016. His essays, journalism, fiction, reviews have appeared widely, including in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and The Nation. He co-edited Fire and Forget, Short Stories from the Long War in 2013, and What Future? The Year's Best Ideas to Reinvent, Reanimate, and Reclaim Our Future, which appeared this year. His New York Times essay, Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene, was selected for the Best American Science and Nature Writing in 2014, and his essay, The Terror of the New, was selected as a notable essay in Best American Essays 2015. He's held a Mrs. Giles G. Whiting Fellowship in the Humanities, won the Teresa A. White Literary Award for short fiction, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences at Rice University in 2016. His next book, We're Doomed, Now What? Dispatches from the Far Side of Hope, is forthcoming from Soho Press, or has it forthcome? July, next July. And his current project, about which he's going to be talking, is a critical genealogy of American World War II literature, tracing how a complex array of texts exploring the problem of the hero in industrial capitalism was obscured and displaced during and after the Vietnam War by a literary canon centered on narratives of American trauma. He arrived here at Notre Dame in 2016, and we are very, very proud that we have been able to bring him here. Please welcome Roy Scranton.
Thank you, Peter, for that introduction, and thank you to the Saturday Scholar program for bringing me. And thank you all for coming. I know you're probably just trying to get out of the rain, but no, I appreciate that you're here, and I hope the talk is interesting. It's interesting to you. It's work that I've been very close to for a long time, and and it's in this sort of final process where it's sort of condensing and getting ready to make its way into the world. And so I say that as a preface because if it may be sometimes a sort of strategic bomber level look at the problem I'm discussing, and then we'll occasionally swoop in very quickly. But I hope it's of interest to you. I think that's all the preamble I've got. I'll just make sure this is going. Yes, and then we'll begin. The true war story is a story of trauma. A young man goes away, his head swimming with visions of courage and his heart yearning for sacrifice, but what he finds instead is death. He sees, causes, and suffers horrific violence, violence that wounds his very soul. After the war, that youth, now a veteran, returns to the world of peace, haunted by his experience, racked by what Judith Herman identifies as the central compulsion of trauma and atrocity, the conflict between the need to publicly witness his encounter with violence and the compulsion to repress it. He struggles to turn the inassimilable reality of the traumatic event into narrative, but finds himself blocked at every turn. The memories slip from his grasp. The powers that be want to cover up the shocking truth of war. No one wants to hear about the horrors he's seen, and it is impossible for people who were not there to understand. As Herman writes, soldiers in every war, even those who have been regarded as heroes, complain bitterly that no one wants to know the real truth about war. The traumatic violence of war destroys even language itself. Literary theorist James Dawes argues in The Language of War that war impairs the human power to describe, define, or narrate. At the broadest level, war interrupts history, war interrupts intersubjective evaluation, and at the most personal level, interrupts self-narration. In an essay in the Cambridge Companion to War Writing, Adam Piet writes, "War zones destructure any narrative that attempts to describe them with powers of menace capable of warping civilian space-time." According to Mary Favret, war, even at a distance, works to dismantle the forms that prop up our sense of the world and our place in it. Frederick Jameson argues that war is an impossible collective totality, a manifold of consciousnesses as unimaginable as it is real, an example of the kind of collective realities which exceed representation fully as much as they do conceptualization, and yet which ceaselessly tempt and exasperate narrative ambitions, conventional and experimental alike. Learning how war damages and exasperates our powers of description, sense-making, intersubjective evaluation, self-narration, and even space-time itself, the veteran comes to understand that war's truth is a truth beyond words. Because war is a world-unmaking event, a reality deconstructing and defamiliarizing activity, writes Margot Norris, the problem the veteran then faces is how to make its inherent epistemological disorientation, its sense of experienced unreality, real. Thus, the soldier's most heroic battle occurs not on the field of combat, but after he has come home, when he strives to bear testimony to his experience. He's gone to war, confronted death, and returned with that most priceless of treasures, self-knowledge. For in passing through the fires of combat, the soldier has learned momentous truths about human existence that rend the illusory veils of modern civilization. As Chris Hedges asserts in his best-selling, award-winning book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, war exposes a side of human nature that is usually masked by the unacknowledged coercion and social constraints that glue us together. Kathy Caruth writes, "It is because the mind cannot confront the possibility of its death directly that survival becomes, for the human being, paradoxically, an endless testimony to the impossibility of living." Similarly, in the words of Martin Heidegger, the closer we come to the danger, the more brightly do the ways into the saving power begin to shine. Integrating this revealed knowledge into his life, turning it into narrative, and testifying to it before his community is precisely how the veteran heals his psychic wounds. The testimony is the process by which the narrator, the survivor, reclaims his position as a witness, writes Dory Laub. Every war story, every true war story, is a story of trauma and recovery, a narrative that struggles to speak the unspeakable truth of war, a story that speaks war's unspeakability. Yet, as Kali Tal reminds us, the task of the traumatized author is an impossible one. While a few survivors may be able to turn their suffering into award-winning literature, many veterans, unable to cope with the impossible task of narrativizing war's, quote, inherent epistemological disorientation, remain stuck in their trauma for decades, compulsively reliving their pain. What one returns to in the flashback is not the incomprehensibility of one's near death, writes Carruth, but the very incomprehensibility of one's own survival. Either way, the veteran, now a survivor and a witness, is known, like the Greek archer Philoctetes, by his wound. His testimony defines him, his work, and his speech. The writings of trauma survivors comprise a distinct literature of trauma, writes Tall. Literature of trauma is defined by the identity of the author. In order to understand this literature, she writes, we must embrace critical strategies that acknowledge the peculiar position of the survivor author and move into the realms of psychology and sociology, acknowledging the specific effects of trauma on the process of narration. So speaks the myth of the trauma hero. This myth is perhaps the single most important cultural frame for understanding the experience of war in America today. It informs our politics, colors our news reports, and underwrites our history. It dominates critical and scholarly interpretation of war literature, war movies, and the visual culture of war. It shapes how children imagine war and how veterans remember it. The myth of the trauma hero is certainly compelling. It claims to speak to deep psychological truths, makes a kind of intuitive sense, and, perhaps most important, makes the veteran a sympathetic victim rather than a perpetrator of violence. It is a myth that harmonizes with the romantic valorization of embodied subjective truth, since it frames war as a personal aesthetic experience rather than a socio-political event, and portrays the experience of war as an experience of transcendental revelation. The trauma hero's revelation is predicated on the idea that subjective experience and physical presence offer a more robust claim to truth and a greater moral authority than do history, eyewitnessing, or other kinds of accounts based in observable evidence or reasoned argument. There's a great joke about the Vietnam War that sort of really illustrates this. How many Vietnam vets does it take to screw in a light bulb? You can't know, you weren't there, right? So that's what I'm talking about. And it's this claim, the trauma hero's truth claim, is a claim to a truth which exists beyond language. It is impossible, it is unspeakable, it is incommunicable. Nevertheless, and not without irony, the trauma hero's claim is a claim that is necessarily made in language, right? The claim of insight into human nature that is usually masked by the unacknowledged coercion and social constraints that glue us together, as Hedges says, is one made within the constraints and coercion of modern society. The truth that the myth of the trauma hero portrays as only being accessible outside the frame of social discourse is a truth that can only be constructed within the frame of social discourse. The truth of war, that is to say, has a history, as does the trauma hero's revelation, as does the trauma hero himself. I began to delve into the history of the trauma hero in 2007 because I was curious about the ways in which the United States wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were being represented. Specifically, I was puzzled by the prevailing emphasis on soldiers' trauma and the heartfelt admiration expressed across the political spectrum for veterans, two things that seemed to be connected. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were corrupt, possibly illegal, and immensely destructive, of dubious merit even from a cynical perspective. Yet our most resonant cultural narratives about the wars focus not on the systemic political failures the wars represented and embodied, or the thousands upon thousands of Iraqi and Afghan lives that were being callously destroyed, but rather on the psychological suffering of individual American soldiers. An instance of this phenomenon can be seen in the story behind the cover of American veteran Brian Turner's award-winning poetry collection, Here, Bullet. The cover of this lauded, well-known, and much-taught book offers an iconic image: a slouching soldier in battle gear staring at the viewer, standing alone against a harsh desert landscape. The image calls to mind countless similar images of battle-weary soldiers, while also invoking the tradition of the American Western through its figure of the solitary cowboy poised against the horizon. The figure in the picture is Turner himself. His gaze challenges the reader with his 1,000-yard stare, at once aggressive and wounded, guarded, and yet suggesting hard wisdom. This image came from a photo that Turner had provided his publisher. Naturally, the photo had needed to be edited. The most important thing that had needed to be done was that the zip-tied, hooded Iraqi prisoners whom Turner and his men had captured needed to be erased. In an interview with the Virginia Quarterly Review, Turner describes the decision-making process at length, offering valuable insight into the process by which artists and editors collaborate in the production of war's truth. The editor at Alice James Books asked me to send along a number of photos so that, while she was editing, she could get a feel for the people that show up in the poems. She wanted a visual feel for the landscape, and I think she was trying to get closer to the material, too. She came across one photo and said, "This has got to be the cover," but it was very contentious for me for several reasons. The contentious part of the photo, and I struggled with this, on the cover just above my name in the lower half of the photo, between the photographer and me, were 3 Iraqi prisoners. They were on their knees, their hands were flex-cuffed behind their backs, and they had sandbags over their heads. Jakowski, he was my M203 gunner, he took the photo. The prisoner on Jakowski's right had a leather jacket on, and we'd written RPG across his back because he'd fired a rocket-propelled grenade. In fact, Jakowski was in the center of a circle of prisoners, about 10 or 13 of them, and the stance that I have in the photo looks sort of like John Wayne. That photo looks like I came over here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum, as they say in the movies. It just wasn't right for a cover photo, especially with the sandbags over the heads, because that's now synonymous with torture. If I were someone walking into a bookstore, as we were talking about this during the editing process, I felt like some people would be repelled by that image. They would just think torture right off the bat, and this book isn't about torture. There are books that need to be written about torture, and some of those are starting to come out, but my book isn't about that. I wanted to invite people into the book rather than push them away. Thus, according to Turner's own account, Turner and his editor worked together to shape an image of the Iraq War that focused on the American soldier, invoked the cowboy hero tradition of John Wayne, and literally erased Iraqi bodies for the cover of a book of lyric poetry published by a respected nonprofit poetry press that had been founded with a feminist and socially progressive mission. The reality of war, specifically the fact of Iraqi bodies, was deemed too repellent for readers to handle. So a new truth was constructed, one that elided the history of torture and the Abu Ghraib scandal, eliminated troublesome Iraqi bodies, and made the war more inviting to American readers. Most poetry readers today would probably not think of words like propaganda, nationalism, or lies when they think of Alice James Books or Brian Turner's poetry. Yet an image invoking nationalist war ideology that was constructed through erasure and deceit is precisely the face Alice James Books put on Turner's poems. As I struggled to understand the motivation behind this process of ideological erasure and reframing I was witnessing in American culture, I began to see that it had something to do with the genealogy of trauma itself, and how trauma had come to be synonymous with war. Trauma as a psychological concept has a long history going back more than a century, a history which has been discussed in detail by scholars such as Ian Hacking, Ruth Lees, Didier Fassin, Richard Reckman, and Alan Young. But trauma really only came into mainstream American culture in the 1970s. As I traced the history of trauma and its connections to American narratives about war, I began to see that the myth of the trauma hero had, at some point in the 20th century, taken on a political function. In a way homologous to the way in which Brian Turner's image was constructed on the cover of Here Bullet, the myth of the trauma hero focuses all of our attention on the solitary American soldier while erasing the bodies of the enemies and innocents that hero killed. I also began to understand that while that political function seemed to be primarily connected to American efforts to make sense of the lost war in Vietnam, it actually had much more to do with the revision of within American cultural memory of the meaning of World War II. The historical, political, and cultural importance of World War II to American life in the 20th century scarcely needs to be argued. Yet for just that reason, it's easy to forget how pervasive, radical, and upsetting the war's effects were. 16 million men were uprooted from their homes, stripped of their civilian identities, shuttled through a vast national bureaucracy, and sent across the country or across the world in what became the greatest experiment in cosmopolitan mixing and mass indoctrination in American history. More than 400,000 of these men died. Another 670,000 of them were wounded. African Americans served in military combat and support units, though these were still segregated, and migrated north and west to work in an expanding defense industry. Los Angeles, Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia all saw African American populations nearly double between 1940 and 1950. Women entered the workforce en masse, suddenly experiencing wholly novel forms of financial and sexual independence. The material culture of American life was transformed beyond imagining. Food production and consumption, housewares, automobile production, home building, highways, television, film, clothing, airplane travel, and the music industry all underwent incredible metamorphoses between the 1930s and the 1950s. Millions of Americans experienced firsthand the terror and excitement of violence, killing, and death, and millions more were imaginatively and emotionally invested in what was perceived as an existential struggle for the future of the planet. Last but not least, the scale of American self-image was wrenched into a new frame as the United States took on leadership of the West, facing first Japan and Nazi Germany, then Soviet Russia, in what would become a winner-take-all contest for global dominance, meanwhile unleashing godlike destructive power in the atomic bomb. If we can say that World War II is a single event, it surely strains the imagination to conceive it as such. Even from a strictly American perspective, what World War II is and means have been contentious and difficult issues from the beginning, not merely because of political investments and predispositions, but also because the sheer scope of the event and its aftershocks remain difficult to assimilate. As Norman Mailer, himself a veteran, wrote in 1957, the Second World War presented a mirror to the human condition which blinded anyone who looked into it. And perhaps it still does, though not for lack of looking. Cultural and aesthetic representations of the war have struggled to come to terms with its staggering historical, ethical, political, and psychological complexity in a variety of ways, in poetry, novels, musicals, history, television miniseries, comic books, video games, and films. From Pearl S. Buck's novel China Sky, depicting American doctors caught in the Japanese invasion of China, to the first-person shooters set in World War II that appeared in the 1990s and 2000s and continue to appear, starting with the now classic Wolfenstein 3D in 1992 and continuing with the blockbuster franchises Medal of Honor and Call of Duty. From Ezra Pound's Pizan cantos to George Lucas's Star Wars, from Chester Himes' novel of racial tensions in wartime Los Angeles, If He Hollers, Let Him Go, to Don DeLillo's novel White Noise, the protagonist of which is a professor of Hitler studies. The amount and variety of American cultural production from the last 70 years, which works explicitly, allegorically, and sometimes unconsciously with and through World War II, is overwhelming. Now, given the tremendous richness and diversity of representations of World War II produced in the last 70-odd years, it seems remarkable that a single narrative strain, that of trauma, has come to dominate the war's literary canon. The short list of canonical American literary works about the war comprises the novels The Naked and the Dead, Catch-22, Slaughterhouse-Five, and Gravity's Rainbow. And this is a painting of Tyrone Slothrop, the protagonist of Gravity's Rainbow, along with a wider array of poems best represented by Randall Jarrell's Death of the Baltimore Gunner, Lewis Simpson's Carentan O Carentan, some of Robert Lowell's anti-war poetry, a few poems by Gwendolyn Brooks, Marianne Moore's In Distrust of Merits, and W.H. Auden's September 1st, 1939. These are the works that occupy the center of both academic and popular discussion of World War II literature, focus attention in canon-setting works such as the Cambridge Companion to the Literature of World War II, and serve as the ready-to-hand examples of World War II literature for teachers and scholars of 20th century American lit. These works are stylistically and topically diverse, yet except for Moore's complex meditation and Auden's rueful lyric, they are alike in that they all rely on the trope of trauma and traumatic revelation. How are we to understand the fact that when it comes to a war in which the United States arose to victory as a global superpower, the canonical literary representations, valorized as aesthetically worthwhile, all tell stories of individual soldiers psychologically traumatized by violence? How did it happen that in the face of the overwhelming amount, variety, and complexity of representations of the experience of World War II, the narrow interpretive frame of trauma has come to dominate canonical literature about that war? Reading across the war's literary archive, from Lincoln Kirstein's ribald poems to Martha Gellhorn's melancholy novel, The Wine of Astonishment, from John Hersey's documentary novels and novelistic reportage to Wallace Stevens' complex meditations on the hero in time of war, one can see that the majority of literary work explicitly concerned with World War II is in fact actively misrepresented by this canon. Just as Brian Turner and his editor went about constructing an image for the cover of Here Bullet that would represent the poetic truth of the Iraq War, a process of aesthetic reframing and erasure has washed out the complexity of World War II literature and replaced it with the image of a traumatized American soldier. How and why did this happen? Even more important, what is this misrepresentative canon leaving out, marginalizing, and obscuring? As my research turned from the so-called War on Terror to World War II, I began to understand that one of the key things that the trauma hero myth has obscured is the way that writers dealing with World War II in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s struggled to make sense of the notion of heroism itself. The problem of the hero was a pervasive early 20th century concern, but World War II revealed that problem as a crisis at the heart of democratic society. Sidney Hook, Eric Bentley, and Kenneth Burke, for example, worried that the relationship between liberal democracy and heroism and hero worship was at best a troubled tension, at worst one of irreconcilable antagonism. At stake was a conflict between the kinds of stories society told itself about its values. On the one hand, a story in which every individual was an equal and independent member of a commercial, democratic, liberal marketplace where everything was for sale. And on the other, a story in which every individual was subordinated to the collective, and the most important thing a citizen could do was to sacrifice their life for the nation. The need to change from a commercial, liberal, monetary nexus of motives to a collective, sacrificial, military nexus of motives was, in Kenneth Burke's words, the salient cultural issue facing the United States during the war. Key to that issue was the problem of the hero, who a hero was, what a hero did, how a hero was represented. Consider, for a moment, these lines from Wallace Stevens' wartime poem, Repetitions of a Young Captain, from 1944, which ponders two problems. First, what happens when the singular hero is multiplied to the point of abstraction? And second, how a lyric poet, as Stevens conceived the role, could relate to the wartime demands for total mobilization, or what he called in a famous short essay on the poetry of war, a participating in the heroic. Millions of major men against their like make more than thunder's rural rumbling. They make the giants that each one of them becomes in a calculated chaos. He that takes form from the others being larger than he was, accoutred in a little of the strength that sweats the sun up on its morning way to giant red, sweats up a giant sense to the make matter, or nothing mind, until this matter makes in years of war. This being in a reality beyond the Finnegan specters in the memory, this elevation in which he seems to be tall, makes him rise above the houses looking down. His route lies through an image in his mind. My root lies through an image in my mind. It is the root that milky millions find, an image that leaves nothing much behind. The image of millions of major men against their like is clear enough. But what are these leviathans, the giants that each one of them becomes? How does this process of leviathan-like gigantism sweat the sun up to giant red? What is Stevens saying when he says it sweats up a giant sense to the make matter, matter nothing mind until this matter makes in years of war? Certainly this has to have something to do with Stevens' long-standing concerns about substance, poiesis, and predication. But what kind of relationship could we say he's positing here between mind and matter, individuals and collectives? The rage to order that he wrote about in his most famous poem, and the night and sea that such rage masters and portions. What do we make of Stevens' claim that the soldier's root lies through an image in his mind, and the comparison Stevens makes here with his own poetic project? We might begin to make sense of this poem, which is surely one of Stevens' most rebarbative lyrics, by juxtaposing it against the work of the populist and now marginal novelist James Jones, whom literary critics have deigned to recognize as a lesser part of the canon, lauded in his day, but now seen to be lacking the kind of formal aesthetic innovation that would make him worthy of critical attention. In fact, James Jones' combat novel, The Thin Red Line, set during the Guadalcanal campaign in the Solomon Islands, takes up the same problem that Stevens pondered in his wartime lyrics, which is the problem of the hero in a time of total mobilization, or how to understand the relationship between the one and the many under the demands of global war. Written with the idea of representing a collective as its protagonist, The Thin Red Line was conceived as the story of an infantry company, C for Charlie Company, followed through its initial combat and its changes and reactions, and how it is different afterwards, as Jones told his editor, Mitchell Burroughs. He described his intention as wanting to write a combat novel in the Proustian style, taking up the modernist dialectic of fragment and whole within an Aristotelian frame of dramatic unity. As James Joyce dramatized the modernizing European world on the dirty streets of Dublin, so James Jones drew a portrait of industrialized war for global empire within the frame of one company of American soldiers in one campaign in one tiny island in the Pacific. About a third of the way into the novel, Jones offers an account of C for Charlie Company's first battle from the point of view of its commander, Captain James Bugger Stein. Everything seems to go wrong for Stein almost immediately, as several men are killed and 2 platoons are trapped under heavy fire. The Japanese defenses seem impregnable, but Stein's commander, Colonel Tall, keeps ordering him to attack. After an argument with Tall by field phone, Stein turns to look back at the hill from which his commander watches him and experiences a Vatic shift in perspective. Stein had a sudden and unholy, heart-freezing picture which transfixed him for a moment, bulge-eyed, of an identical recurrence up there now, of the scene he himself had witnessed on Hill 207 2 days ago. The same harassed, apprehensive battalion colonel with field glasses, the same diffident but equally apprehensive little knot of eagles and stars peering over his spiritual shoulder, the same massed mob of pawns and minor pieces craning to see like a stadium crowd. All were up there right now, going through the identical gyrations their identical counterparts had gone through 2 days ago, while down below were the same blood-sweating captains and their troops going through theirs. It was a horrifying vision, all of them doing the same identical thing, all of them powerless to stop it, all of them devoutly and proudly believing themselves to be free individuals. It expanded to include the scores of nations, the millions of men, doing the same on thousands of hilltops across the world. And it didn't stop there. It went on. It was the concept, the fact, the reality of the modern state. It is on just this point, where the infinite repetitions of combat manifest a changed reality of individual men taking on new, gigantic forms, where industrialized warfare turns heroic sacrifice into a grotesque machinery of mass death, that Wallace Stevens and James Jones resonate most together. In Repetitions of a Young Captain, Wallace Stevens is directly concerned with the ontology of the political as a giant sense is made matter, as this being in a reality beyond the finikin specters of memory is created by young blood-sweating captains whose sacrifice transforms the idea of a collective identity, the United States of America, into a political body. And Stevens' meditation on the subject is as troubled as Jones is horrified. Both Wallace Stevens and James Jones are deeply concerned with what participating in the heroic means when the heroic is produced in masses. Just as Stevens sees Leviathan-like giants arising out of sweaty multitudes and the conceptual reality of the make matter, matter nothing mind, Stein's thought abstracts from the repetitions before him Stein's thought abstracts the repetitions before him out from a particular moment to the ontology of the political as such. It was the concept, the fact, the reality of the modern state. Stein's swift shift here from concept to reality, the dialectical collapse of the two into a question and answer caught in a parenthetical interjection, struggling to sum up and define the sense of millions of major men against their like, the move from concept to discrete fact, then to totalized reality, reinscribes the metaphoric relation of the soldier's sacrifice as a scene of industrial horror. Mass-produced repetition, the sine qua non of industrial capitalism, makes a grotesque mockery of nationalist sacrifice. In effect, and in ways that I can only hint at today, World War II opened wide a conflict that had been building within the industrial world since the Napoleonic Wars. The conflict between nationalism and capitalism. Specifically, the conflict between the metaphoric logic of nationalism and the metaphoric logic of capitalism around the issue of bodily sacrifice. In nationalism, collective identity is formed in a traditional pre-modern way through the sacrifice and sacralization of a human body. The individual hero gives his body to and for the people, thus giving substance to the collective's notion of itself, here the nation. Capitalism, in contrast, resists such sacrifice, since the human body must be converted, like everything else, into a commodity, wage labor. In World War II, governmental demands for the total mobilization of economic and spiritual resources conflicted powerfully with capitalism's totalizing logic of commodity exchange. To put it another way, while we tend to think of the major ideological conflict behind World War II, the gigantomachia peri tes vicius, the battle of giants concerning being, as being between democracy and totalitarianism, in fact, the key conflict behind World War II is better understood as occurring between two totalizing forms of social organization competing to control the world, nationalism and capitalism. This conflict did not end with VJ Day, though, but persisted through the Vietnam War, and indeed persists today. The deep cultural power of the myth of the trauma hero is in how it offers a way to contain and sort of spirit away this conflict. Returning to the question with which I began, of what makes a true war story, and the idea that war is a fundamentally mystical experience, traumatic and unrepresentable, I want to turn back to Frederick Jameson, who in his 2013 book, The Antinomies of Realism, argues that representations of collective activity in war are no more than the abstraction of something else, namely wage labor. Jameson is explicitly thinking of war films of the collective buddy type, which are one subgenre of the combat film, which is itself one version of the modern war story. But Jameson extends his argument back through to the late 18th century. He eventually argues that war is merely another unrepresentable kind of collective activity. He writes, group, nation, clan, class, general will, multitude, all these remain so many linguistic experiments for designating an impossible collective totality, a manifold of consciousnesses as unimaginable as it is real. War is one among such collective realities which exceed representation fully as much as they do conceptualization, and yet which ceaselessly tempt and exasperate narrative ambitions, conventional and experimental alike. Jameson's claim is asserted in the face of the very evidence he himself lays out, since what he is discussing are precisely representations of war. Further, as the work of James Jones and Wallace Stevens shows in ways that I've only gestured at here, the concept of the collective is represented in the sacrifice of its hero. Those who sacrifice their existence for the sake of a concept such as the nation literally give that concept a body. They make it substantial. They make it real. But the structural function of the hero as a sacrifice mediating between a collective and its concept of itself only gets us part of the way toward understanding the limitations of the argument that representations of war are always displacing or veiling more fundamental structures of wage labor, and the more pervasive suspicion that war is ultimately unrepresentable. Notwithstanding the philosophically trivial observation that omniscient representation is, as such, impossible, and that any narrative position is ultimately limited, or in Wallace Stevens' words, that the squamous facts exceed or in Wallace Stevens' words, that the squirming facts exceed the squamous mind, the human being must and does behave as if it understood reality, laying faith in its social fictions. When push comes to shove, though, some fictions carry more ontological weight than others. The concrete realization of concepts in blood sacrifice, the structuring of metaphoric relations in the substance of human bodies, authors the kinds of narratives against which more universalist narratives are usually found wanting. Hence, many writers' deep anxiety about the problem of the hero in the 1940s. Truth as a play of metaphors, as Stevens defines it, consonant with a structuring logic of exchange in which words and money are the mediating terms and any thing can be substituted for any other thing, stood threatened by a definition of truth whose media were lives and blood. Blood sacrifice shifts socioeconomic relations from a horizontal differential of exchange in which any two objects are unified in their difference through signs, and this you may recognize from Marx, his sort of abstract formula of commodity exchange. You change a commodity for money, which you then spend on another commodity, and so on and so on. So blood sacrifice shifts socioeconomic relations from a horizontal differential of exchange in which any two objects are unified in their difference through signs to a vertical differential of exchange in which a concept is given substantial reality by being mediated through bodies. Right, so you have the collective, and it's mediated through this figure, and thus the collective's relationship to its concept of itself is mediated, right, and given substance through this sacrifice, this figure of the hero. Whereas capitalism and its poets, such as Wallace Stevens, offers material relations between persons and social relations between things, modern war manifests conceptual relations between persons and material relations between ideas. The representations and narratives of war that reiterate these relations in symbolic structures, the songs that sing of heroes and war for all the ages, are best understood not as ideological in the sense Jameson seems to want to suggest, and that they obscure more fundamental relations, but ideological in an even stronger sense, in that they represent the social embodiment of conceptual reality. The problem Jones and Stevens grapple with is not that industrial war in a time of total mobilization is unrepresentable or even traumatic, but that industrialized war opens a conflict between the metaphoric structures by which capitalism and nationalism each organize reality. In the 1960s and 1970s, the trauma hero emerged out of this problem as an imaginary solution to the real contradictions between capitalism and nationalism, offering a satisfying narrative of sacrifice that fosters a sense of communal belonging, yet still preserves the body for labor, in ideological form at least, since the sacrifice the trauma hero undergoes is no longer physical, but only psychological. In this way, wartime sacrifice is enlisted to serve two masters, now locked in an uneasy alliance. The trauma hero does not die for the nation, but suffers spiritually for it. The trauma hero does not bleed for the nation, but weeps while spilling blood for it. The trauma hero does not embody the national ideal, but performs its ideal by turning the brute fact of death into an exchangeable commodity, by translating the real into the symbolic, by turning blood sacrifice into a sign, an artwork, or a story. In the wake of World War II, as the war machine and the capitalist machine joined together in what Eisenhower called in his monitory final address as president, the military-industrial complex, the totalizing logic of the market absorbed even the idea of total sacrifice. Total mobilization in a time of permanent crisis demands that we continue to give our laboring, consuming bodies to the global marketplace while sacrificing our souls to the truth of the nation. As in the implicit maxim Americans were handed down after 9/11, keep working and shopping, only support the troops. This is a more substantive example of that, something George Bush said. Go get down to Disney World, take your families. This is how you fight the war on terror. The project from which this talk is drawn, Total Mobilization, World War II and American Literature, which I've only barely sketched here, and which discusses, in addition to Wallace Stevens and James Jones, the work of Joan Didion, Kenneth Koch, Ralph Ellison, Randall Jarrell, and Thomas Pynchon, and squeezes in a Bugs Bunny cartoon and Star Wars as well, is intended to offer a revision of the postmodern, post-traumatic revision of World War II by returning to the war itself as a form of culture. As Kenneth Burke wrote in 1941, Sunday school texts have ever been considered by sophisticated moralists the essential stimulus to sin, and I see no reason why the same fact should not apply to Sunday school simplification in dealing with the problems of war. On the other hand, let war be put forward as a cultural way of life, as one channel of effort in which people can be profoundly human, and you induce in the reader the fullest possible response to war. Precisely such a response is my best lead one to appreciate the preferable ways of peace. I mean to stake a claim that we must return to World War II in all its complexity and difficulty, neither in repudiation nor in glorification, but by inhabiting its affective realms of terror, violence, responsibility, and ethical conflict. My core argument is threefold. First, that readers and literary scholars have mistaken the relationship between World War II and American literature by focusing on a handful of misrepresentative texts, and that in order to understand the impact of that war on American culture and literature, we must return to the archive with fresh eyes. Second, that when we do so, we see that for American writers trying to make sense of the war, one of the central problems, if not the central problem, was the role of the hero in total industrialized war. Third, that trauma as an interpretive frame for the experience of war emerged as an ideological solution to the problem of the hero and successfully took hold in the American political imaginary as a self-serving way of reinterpreting the history of American violence. It is my hope to substantially revise the way that we read World War II in American literature and American war literature in general, since only by so doing will we be able to understand the full import of World War II for American literature and see that the definitive fact of late 20th century American culture is neither postmodernism nor the Cold War, but World War II and its repercussions. The stakes of this claim are historical and literary, but they are also political. For as long as we see war as something outside and beyond civilized discourse, a traumatic real manifesting a truth beyond language, we continue to obscure the violence foundational to American power. And as long as we confuse nationalism with liberalism, we continue to feed the unholy terror engine of American exceptionalism. As much as this project is about recovering the war lost behind the image that we've constructed of World War II, it is also about recovering what might not yet be lost behind the image of war we live in today. Thank you. So we have some time for questions, and I would love to hear questions, comments, anything you might have to say about that. Yes?
It's an unenlightened question, but do you imagine there's a big body of literature out there that has sort of been forgotten through this lens that you're talking about, or because of this lens?
Yes, and I would say neglected more than forgotten. Much of the literature is sort of seen in the distance, but often profoundly neglected and misunderstood. One example is, I talk about James Jones and Wallace Stevens here, but another example, two great examples. One is the work of Joan Didion, right? The novelist and journalist. Now, she was 7 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So she didn't fight in World War II or anything like that. But her work is mostly read, it seems to me, against the backdrop of the 1960s, because that's where her most famous pieces come out of. But I would argue that in order to really understand Joan Didion and her work, what you have to understand is how her father being called up from the National Guard into active duty service, and their family being dragged across the country when Joan Didion was 7, 8 years old, right, was a profoundly disruptive and formative experience for her that was then compounded by her return to California, which had been transformed beyond imagining, right? The war just utterly changed California through wartime industry and building military bases and the post-war vet boom, right? Highways and so on. And so I would argue that Joan Didion, right, is an example where we need to understand her not primarily in terms of her relation to the 1960s, but as someone who's working out through her entire body of work what World War II means for American culture, right? Including, right, how we see the 1960s in relation to World War II. Another shorter example is, say, Herman Wouk's novel, The Caine Mutiny, which, a lot of critics would probably disparage as a kind of sentimental, conventional novel. But it's actually a really fascinating exploration of the problem of command and collective life and the ethical situations that arise around leadership. And you don't see any of that stuff if you're looking for war as trauma, right? You don't see what's interesting about James Jones if you expect trauma, and that's the case with just quite a few really, really interesting works. So yeah, that's one major point of my argument. Thanks. Yes.
Is trauma largely a 20th century concept?
That seems fair. It starts. It emerges in the late 19th century. Along with with modern psychology as a theoretical and pseudo-medical discourse. And some people push it back into the early 19th century, and other people argue, I think speciously, that trauma is an inherent human feature that you can find in ancient Greek culture. I think that's a misunderstanding. I think trauma is a complicated phenomenon, and I can talk more about it if there are more questions specifically about it. But I do think it's right that it's a 20th century phenomenon, and it's a way of understanding our relationship to memory, and it's a way of understanding our relationship to the body, and it's a way of understanding our relationship. It's a way mostly, I would argue, it's a way of talking about things that we don't want to, things that we don't want to talk about. Right? It's a way of talking about things that we want to refuse as being part of civilized society, like war or the Holocaust. Right? We want to insist these things are not understandable. Yeah. Thanks. Yes.
You had occasion in the course of your research to talk with veterans of World War II or other conflicts, veterans who experienced combat trauma directly. If so, how has that informed you?
So I should out myself. I'm a veteran of the war in Iraq myself, and I've talked to many veterans of Vietnam, fewer of World War II because there's just fewer left of them around. But I have spoken with World War II veterans, and many veterans who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and many veterans who participated in combat or other kinds of traumatogenic, activities. And it was, trying to make sense of this that really motivated a lot of my initial research because, I know people whose lives have been destroyed by their post-traumatic stress disorder, right? The way that they carry things that they did in Iraq or Afghanistan, or things that happened to them or their friends, like the psychological effects are real and often catastrophic. And yet, trauma is one of these interesting sort of, it's basically Freudian derived, but it's an interesting psychological phenomenon in that it's not really an empirical phenomenon, right? There are ways that they can measure stress, the effects of stress on the brain, and reactions to that, and there are ways that they can measure things that are connected to post-traumatic stress disorder, such as hyperarousal and adrenaline response and depletion, and so on. And so there's a lot of complexities around there that can be talked about empirically. But trauma itself, as a phenomenon, as a diagnosis, right, is specifically about an event and how it's remembered. And there's no clear way to figure out why some events are traumatic and why some aren't, why some events are traumatic for some people and not for other people. And there's also no real empirical way to figure out how trauma necessarily manifests in certain symptoms. And so it's this profoundly complicated discourse that has a relation to empirical reality, and yet is also a social fact, right? Constructed like it's a cultural fact that shapes the way people understand their experiences, right? If you go to war knowing you're supposed to be traumatized, then you will manifest traumatic symptoms. If you come back and you're processing various things, identity crisis, and so on. There's a lot of stuff that happens coming back from a war that isn't just combat stress, right? But it all becomes trauma through these discourses that we're told is how we understand war. World War II veterans, an interesting case, like Holocaust survivors, often didn't understand their experience as traumatic, even if they had undergone combat stress, even if they're certain, even if they'd had a difficult time, they often didn't understand their experience as traumatic afterwards because that wasn't the frame for conceptualizing it. understanding World War II as traumatic only came later in the 60s and 70s. So I guess the short answer is that knowing veterans, being a veteran, talking with veterans has both motivated me to figure out what the hell's going on with this idea of trauma and what it has to do with with American society's valorization of the veteran, and also motivated me to try to attend to the real complexities of the problem. Yeah. More questions? Yeah, there in the back. It depended. This is one thing a lot of the interesting writers, I was looking at are trying to figure out. There was for some, trauma was a sort of way of understanding it. For others, there was a sense of duty and fulfilling that duty, and then, if there are psychological after effects to combat or combat stress, it was often understood in terms of a kind of fatigue, or a physical ailment, not so much a problem of memory, not so much a problem of psychological trauma, but of having been, on the front for so long, or having been shipped from place to place, as sort of the grinding physical aspects of it. And then, I think part of the conceptualization afterward as well was a sense of collective relief and a sense of collective relief that the war was over, and a sense of collective, I guess I would say even a sense of collective suffering, like that the war was something Americans went through, not an individual, right? And of course that's more complicated too, because a lot of veterans were very resentful of how easy civilians had it back home. But among veterans, there's 16 million veterans, 16 million Americans served in the war. Not all of them overseas, of course, not all of them in combat. It's much smaller percentages, but there's a way in which, the experience was so broad that to assert one's individual sort of suffering in response, to understand it as like, this is my suffering and my trauma, would have gone against the grain of what had been, in fact, a much more collective experience. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for that. Thanks for coming. Go be Navy.